The most dangerous mistake people make is believing they can judge a person in the first 5 seconds. Nobody in the room knew how true those words were about to become. The annual Veterans Appreciation Banquet in Norfolk, Virginia had drawn hundreds of guests from across the region. Active duty service members, retired military families, local officials, and community leaders filled the large ballroom with conversation and laughter. American flags stood beside the stage, photographs honoring generations of service lined the walls, and a military band quietly played familiar patriotic melodies near the entrance. It was supposed to be an evening of recognition and respect. Yet in one corner of the room sat a woman who seemed completely out of place. Emily Carter occupied a chair near the back row, far from the stage and even farther from the center of attention. She wore a simple navy blue jacket, dark jeans, and comfortable shoes. There were no medals pinned to her clothing, no insignia, no name tag identifying her accomplishments. Nothing about her appearance suggested she belonged among the decorated guests who filled the ballroom. She arrived alone, checked in quietly, and took the first available seat she could find. While other guests greeted old friends and exchanged stories, Emily remained by herself, occasionally smiling at passing conversations but never attempting to join them. To most people, she looked like an ordinary visitor who had somehow wandered into the wrong event. A few tables away, several younger veterans noticed her almost immediately. One of them glanced toward the back of the room and shrugged. Another laughed softly. Their attention returned to her several times over the next few minutes. They were not being openly cruel, but they were curious in the way people sometimes become curious about someone who does not seem to fit. Eventually, one of them joked that she must be waiting for somebody important. Another suggested she was probably a guest of a guest. The comments were harmless on the surface, but they carried the familiar tone of people making assumptions before knowing the facts. Emily appeared not to notice. She simply sat quietly and watched the room. Every now and then she looked toward the stage where the evening program would soon begin. Her expression never changed. She did not seem uncomfortable. She did not appear offended. If she heard the comments, she gave no indication. In fact, she seemed completely at peace being overlooked. As the ballroom continued to fill, the energy in the room shifted. More distinguished guests began arriving. Heads turned toward the entrance as respected military leaders entered one after another. Conversations paused. People stood to shake hands. Cameras flashed. The anticipation grew stronger with every passing minute because everyone knew one particular guest was expected to arrive soon. Commander Ryan Mitchell, one of the most respected SEAL leaders in the country, had agreed to attend the banquet. His reputation alone was enough to make the audience excited. Many hoped for a chance to hear him speak. Others simply wanted to see him in person. Near the back of the room, Emily remained exactly where she was, calm and unnoticed. Nobody approached her. Nobody asked her story. Nobody imagined that before the night was over, the entire room would be looking in her direction. And nobody could have guessed that the arrival of one man was about to transform a forgotten woman in the back row into the center of attention for a reason none of them would ever forget. The conversations throughout the ballroom grew louder as more guests arrived, and the attention that had briefly drifted toward Emily faded once again. The younger veterans several tables away became increasingly comfortable with their assumptions. One of them glanced toward the back row and shook his head with an amused smile. He quietly remarked that every year there seemed to be someone who attended these events hoping to meet important people. Another laughed and suggested that Emily probably had no idea who would be walking through those doors in the next few minutes. The comments were met with chuckles around the table. None of them intended real harm, but their confidence came from believing they already understood the entire story. Emily remained completely unaffected. She adjusted her chair slightly and continued observing the room. A volunteer passed by and offered her a program booklet for the evening. Emily thanked her warmly and accepted it. She spent several moments reading through the schedule before placing it neatly on her lap. Her calm demeanor stood in sharp contrast to the growing excitement spreading through the ballroom. Near the stage, organizers checked microphones and reviewed notes. Local reporters prepared cameras. Community leaders gathered near reserved seating. Everyone seemed focused on the arrival of distinguished guests. Everyone except Emily. She appeared perfectly content sitting alone in the back row. As the minutes passed, a few attendees began noticing her for a different reason. While many guests constantly checked their phones, searched for better seats, or looked for opportunities to introduce themselves to important figures, Emily did none of those things. She simply watched. Her posture was relaxed but attentive. Her eyes moved naturally around the room, quietly taking in details others ignored. At one point, a server accidentally dropped a stack of napkins near the aisle. Before anyone else reacted, Emily stood, helped gather them, thanked the embarrassed employee, and returned to her seat without drawing attention to herself. The simple gesture lasted less than 30 seconds, yet it revealed something unusual about her character. She carried herself with quiet confidence rather than a need to be noticed. Unfortunately, that quality only reinforced the assumptions of those who misunderstood her. One of the younger veterans interpreted her silence as nervousness. Another concluded she was intimidated by the military environment around her. They continued their casual speculation, unaware that the woman they were discussing had already experienced situations requiring far greater composure than anything happening inside a banquet hall. Then the atmosphere suddenly shifted. A movement near the entrance drew attention from across the room. Conversation slowed. Heads turned. Several people immediately stood from their seats. Others reached for their phones. The expected guest had finally arrived. Commander Ryan Mitchell entered the ballroom accompanied by event organizers and several respected veterans. Even from a distance, his presence commanded attention. People greeted him with admiration and respect. Handshakes began almost immediately. The energy throughout the room transformed as guests tried to catch a glimpse of him. Near the back row, Emily slowly looked up from her program booklet. For the first time all evening, a faint smile appeared on her face. It was not the smile of a fan seeing a famous figure. It looked more like the expression of someone recognizing an old chapter of life returning unexpectedly. Across the crowded ballroom, Ryan Mitchell acknowledged greetings while moving through the entrance area. Then, in the middle of a conversation, he suddenly stopped. His eyes fixed on something near the back of the room. The smile disappeared from his face. The room continued moving around him, but Ryan seemed momentarily frozen. He had seen someone he never expected to find there. For several long seconds, Commander Ryan Mitchell remained completely still near the entrance. The organizers beside him continued speaking, unaware that he was no longer listening. His attention was focused entirely on the woman sitting quietly in the back row. The expression on his face changed from surprise to disbelief, and then to something deeper, something that looked remarkably close to respect. Around him, guests continued reaching out for handshakes and introductions, but Ryan barely seemed to notice. One of the event coordinators gently repeated a question, assuming he had simply been distracted by the crowd. Ryan nodded automatically, yet his eyes never left Emily Carter. Meanwhile, Emily noticed him looking in her direction. She did not wave. She did not stand. She simply offered the same small, calm smile she had worn earlier. It was a simple gesture, but it seemed to confirm something in Ryan's mind. Several people standing nearby began noticing the unusual exchange. One retired officer followed Ryan's line of sight toward the back of the ballroom. Another guest looked in the same direction. Confusion spread quickly because nobody could identify the woman who had suddenly captured the attention of one of the most respected commanders in the room. At the table where the younger veterans were sitting, the mood shifted as well. One of them laughed nervously and suggested that Ryan must have mistaken her for someone else. Another agreed and pointed out that there was no way a person sitting alone in the back row could be important enough to attract that kind of attention. Their confidence sounded less convincing now than it had earlier. Something about Ryan's reaction did not fit their assumptions. Near the stage, the master of ceremonies prepared to begin the evening's program. The band finished a patriotic selection, and guests slowly returned to their seats. Ryan was expected to join several distinguished visitors near the front of the room, where reserved seating had been arranged specifically for him. Instead of moving toward those seats, however, he remained standing near the entrance. His eyes continued searching the crowded ballroom until they settled once again on Emily. The distance between them was nearly 50 feet, yet it seemed as though an entire conversation had taken place without either person speaking a word. Emily lowered her gaze briefly and folded her hands in her lap. She looked completely comfortable, as if she had no expectation that anything unusual was happening. That calmness only deepened the mystery. Most people would have reacted with excitement after attracting the attention of someone like Ryan Mitchell. Emily reacted as though she had seen him 100 times before. Ryan finally took a slow breath. Then he did something nobody expected. Ignoring the reserved seating area, ignoring the cluster of local officials waiting to greet him, and ignoring several introductions that had been carefully arranged for the evening, he began walking. Not toward the stage, not toward the front tables. He started moving directly through the center of the ballroom, toward the back row. Conversations faded one by one as guests noticed his path. Heads turned. Eyes followed him. The younger veterans stopped talking altogether. Even the event staff seemed confused. The farther Ryan walked, the clearer his destination became. He was heading straight toward the woman everyone had overlooked. And with every step he took, the feeling spread through the room that they were about to witness something none of them had anticipated when the evening began. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath as Commander Ryan Mitchell continued walking toward the back row. The sound of conversations gradually disappeared until only the faint music from the speakers remained. People exchanged confused glances. Some stood slightly from their seats to get a better view. Others turned completely around to follow his movement. Nobody understood why one of the most respected military leaders in attendance had chosen to ignore the front tables, the dignitaries, and the carefully planned schedule. Ryan never hesitated. His pace remained steady and deliberate. With each step, curiosity spread further through the room. Emily Carter watched him approach with the same calm expression she had maintained all evening. There was no surprise on her face, no nervousness, no excitement. She looked like someone greeting a familiar colleague rather than a nationally respected commander. That contrast only made the situation more puzzling for everyone watching. When Ryan finally reached the back row, he stopped directly in front of her chair. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The silence seemed to stretch across the entire ballroom. Several guests leaned forward. The younger veterans who had spent much of the evening speculating about Emily now stared without saying a word. One of them quietly muttered that perhaps she was a distant relative. Another suggested she might have worked with a military charity. They searched desperately for an explanation that made sense. Then something happened that instantly erased every theory in the room. Ryan straightened his posture. His shoulders squared. His expression became solemn. Those familiar with military customs immediately recognized the change. A fraction of a second later, he raised his hand and rendered a formal salute. Gasps spread throughout the ballroom. A few people looked at one another to make sure they had seen it correctly. Some believed they must have misunderstood what was happening. Yet there was no mistake. Commander Ryan Mitchell was standing in front of an unknown woman seated in the back row, offering her a salute marked by unmistakable respect. Emily slowly rose from her chair. Her expression remained composed, but there was warmth in her eyes. She returned the gesture with equal professionalism. The exchange lasted only a few seconds, yet it carried a significance that everyone could feel even if they could not understand it. When the salute ended, Ryan lowered his hand and smiled. It was the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him since entering the ballroom. The tension around him seemed to disappear instantly. Several organizers standing near the front looked completely stunned. One local official whispered to another, asking who the woman was. The answer never came because nobody seemed to know. The mystery only deepened. Ryan and Emily exchanged a few quiet words that nearby guests could not hear. Whatever was said caused both of them to smile briefly. There was an ease between them that suggested years of mutual trust and respect. It was not the interaction of strangers meeting unexpectedly. It was the interaction of two people connected by experiences few others could understand. Across the room, the younger veterans sat frozen. The confidence they had displayed earlier had vanished completely. They replayed every assumption they had made since arriving. Suddenly, those assumptions felt embarrassingly incomplete. If a commander of Ryan Mitchell's stature considered this woman worthy of such public respect, then she was clearly far more than anyone had imagined. And as the room struggled to process what it had just witnessed, one question began spreading from table to table. Not what had happened. Everyone had seen that. The question was much bigger. Who exactly was Emily Carter, and what had she done to earn a salute that seemed to carry the weight of an entire untold history? The ballroom remained unusually quiet even after Ryan and Emily finished their brief exchange. It was as though nobody wanted to be the first person to speak and risk interrupting whatever significance had just unfolded before them. Ryan gestured respectfully toward an empty seat at a nearby table, but Emily politely shook her head and returned to the same chair she had occupied all evening. That simple decision only intensified the curiosity surrounding her. Most people who suddenly became the focus of attention would have welcomed a more prominent place in the room. Emily seemed perfectly comfortable remaining exactly where she was. Ryan nodded with understanding, as if he had expected that answer. He then turned and began walking back toward the front of the ballroom. This time, however, the atmosphere was completely different. Every person watching him now carried the same question. Why would a commander with his reputation publicly salute a woman that nobody recognized? The younger veterans who had spent much of the evening making assumptions about Emily were now visibly uncomfortable. One of them stared down at his table, while another replayed the moment in his mind. The more they thought about it, the less sense their earlier conclusions made. They had judged her appearance, her seat location, and her silence. Yet none of those things had revealed who she truly was. Nearby guests had started forming their own theories. Some believed Emily might be a highly decorated veteran whose records remained classified. Others wondered whether she had worked in intelligence or special operations. A few speculated that she could be related to someone famous in military history. Every theory sounded plausible for a few moments before falling apart under scrutiny. The truth remained hidden. Meanwhile, the master of ceremonies attempted to resume the evening program. He welcomed guests, thanked sponsors, and introduced several community leaders. Normally, those remarks would have held the audience's full attention. Tonight was different. People listened politely, but their thoughts kept drifting toward the woman in the back row. Several attendees subtly turned around during the presentation just to look at her again. Emily appeared completely unaware of the attention she was receiving. She listened respectfully to the speakers, applauded when appropriate, and behaved exactly as she had before the salute. There was no sign that she viewed herself as special. That humility only made her more intriguing. Ryan eventually took his assigned seat near the stage. Yet even from across the ballroom, people noticed that he occasionally glanced toward the back row. Not out of concern or curiosity, but out of the kind of respect reserved for someone whose accomplishments carried real weight. Those observations did not go unnoticed by the audience. If anything, they deepened the mystery. Then a particularly interesting moment occurred. During a brief intermission, a retired colonel seated near Ryan leaned over and quietly asked a question. Several nearby guests could not hear the words, but they saw Ryan's reaction. He smiled slightly and shook his head. Whatever answer he provided seemed deliberately incomplete. The colonel's eyebrows rose in surprise, and he slowly turned to look at Emily. That single reaction spread through the room almost as quickly as the salute itself. If even experienced military leaders were surprised by her identity, then the story behind her had to be extraordinary. By now, the entire banquet had become less about the scheduled program and more about the unanswered question hanging over every table. People no longer wondered whether Emily deserved respect. Ryan had already settled that issue. What they desperately wanted to know was what remarkable chapter of military history remained hidden behind the quiet woman sitting alone in the back row. The mystery continued to grow until it became impossible to ignore. Even the scheduled speakers seemed aware that the audience's attention had shifted elsewhere. After several presentations and awards, the master of ceremonies returned to the podium and announced a special recognition segment. The room applauded politely, but many guests were still exchanging quiet theories about Emily Carter. Ryan Mitchell sat near the stage listening carefully. His expression suggested he knew exactly what everyone was wondering. When the applause faded, the master of ceremonies thanked the evening's honored guests and invited Ryan to share a few remarks with the audience. The response was immediate. People straightened in their seats. Cameras were raised once again. Ryan stood, adjusted his jacket, and walked toward the podium. His reputation alone guaranteed attention, yet tonight there was an additional layer of anticipation. Many suspected that he might finally explain the remarkable moment that had unfolded earlier. Ryan thanked the organizers and spoke briefly about service, sacrifice, and community. His words were thoughtful and sincere, earning several rounds of applause. Then he paused. The silence that followed felt different. It was the kind of pause that signals an important story is about to begin. Ryan looked across the room before allowing his gaze to settle on the back row. Immediately, dozens of people turned to look at Emily. She remained seated, calm as ever. Ryan smiled slightly. Many years ago, he began, I had the privilege of working alongside someone whose professionalism changed the outcome of an operation that very few people ever heard about. The audience became completely silent. Ryan continued carefully. He explained that the mission had involved multiple teams operating under difficult conditions. Communication challenges, uncertainty, and rapidly changing circumstances had placed enormous pressure on everyone involved. Yet throughout those challenges, one individual remained remarkably composed. According to Ryan, this person possessed an unusual ability to assess situations, stay focused, and make decisions that protected others when confusion threatened to take over. He never mentioned a name. He never described a rank. Instead, he focused entirely on character. He spoke about discipline, humility, and responsibility. He described someone who never sought recognition and never asked for praise. Someone who measured success not by personal achievements, but by the success of the people around them. The more he spoke, the more the audience listened. Several guests glanced toward Emily again, beginning to suspect where the story might be leading. Ryan explained that after the mission concluded, numerous recommendations were made to publicly recognize the individual responsible for helping the team succeed. To the surprise of many leaders involved, that person declined every opportunity for public attention. Awards ceremonies were avoided. Interviews were refused. Public appearances became almost non-existent. The story sounded almost unbelievable in an era when recognition was often welcomed and celebrated. Yet Ryan spoke with absolute certainty. Then he said something that immediately captured every person's attention. He explained that over the years, many people had heard fragments of the story. Some knew details of the mission. Others knew the accomplishments. But very few knew the identity of the person behind them. Several guests leaned forward. The younger veterans who had spent the evening questioning Emily's presence now stared at the stage without blinking. Ryan paused once more and looked toward the back row. This time, his smile carried unmistakable admiration. Everyone in the ballroom could feel that the answer they had been seeking all night was finally approaching. The ballroom was so quiet that the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed unusually loud. Every eye remained fixed on Commander Ryan Mitchell as he stood behind the podium. The anticipation that had been building throughout the evening had reached its peak. Nobody was looking at their phones anymore. Nobody was whispering. The entire room was waiting for the answer. Ryan rested his hands lightly on the podium and allowed the silence to linger for a moment longer. Then he spoke. He explained that during his career he had served with remarkable people whose names would never appear in history books. Some preferred privacy. Others simply believed that doing their job did not require public recognition. Yet among all those individuals, he said there were a rare few whose influence could never be measured by medals, headlines, or official records. The room remained completely still. Ryan then turned his attention toward the back row once again. This time there was no mystery in his expression, only admiration. He explained that the individual he had been describing had spent years avoiding public attention despite repeated opportunities to accept it. He spoke about someone who consistently placed the mission, the team, and the people around her ahead of personal recognition. Someone whose judgment earned trust from experienced professionals and whose quiet leadership inspired confidence even during the most demanding circumstances. Then he smiled and finally said the words everyone had been waiting to hear. The woman sitting in the back row, Emily Carter, was the person behind the story. For a second, the audience seemed unable to process what they had heard. Many people instinctively turned toward Emily at the same time. Others looked back at Ryan, as if expecting additional clarification. But Ryan simply nodded. The answer was that simple. Emily Carter was the individual he had been describing all along. A wave of surprise moved through the room. Several guests exchanged stunned looks. The younger veterans who had spent much of the evening making assumptions about her sat frozen in disbelief. Every casual comment they had made earlier now echoed in their minds. They had judged a person they knew absolutely nothing about. Meanwhile, Emily looked almost embarrassed by the attention. She lowered her gaze briefly and offered a small smile, as though she wished the focus would return to someone else. Ryan continued speaking. He explained that what impressed him most was not Emily's professional accomplishments. It was her character. He told the audience that true leadership often appeared in unexpected forms. Sometimes it came from the loudest voice in the room, but more often it came from the quiet person who consistently did the right thing without seeking credit. According to Ryan, Emily represented that principle better than almost anyone he had ever known. The audience listened carefully as he described how she had repeatedly chosen humility over recognition. Even after earning the respect of highly accomplished military professionals, she had continued living a private life away from public attention. She had never attempted to build a reputation from her experiences. She had never used her background to elevate herself above others. Instead, she remained exactly the same person. Honest, professional, humble. By the time Ryan finished speaking, the atmosphere inside the ballroom had completely transformed. The mystery was gone, but something more powerful had replaced it. Respect. The woman who had entered unnoticed and taken a seat in the back row was no longer a stranger. And for many people in that room, the lesson was becoming impossible to ignore. Sometimes the most extraordinary person is the one nobody notices at first. For several moments after Ryan finished speaking, nobody moved. The audience seemed caught between surprise and admiration. The mystery that had dominated the evening had finally been answered, yet the truth felt even more remarkable than the rumors and theories that had circulated throughout the ballroom. Emily Carter remained seated in the same chair where she had spent the entire evening. Nothing about her posture changed. Nothing about her expression suggested she had been waiting for recognition. If anything, she appeared slightly uncomfortable being the center of attention. That reaction only reinforced everything Ryan had said about her character. The master of ceremonies stepped forward and thanked Ryan for sharing the story. Then he looked toward Emily and asked if she would be willing to join them near the stage. A wave of applause immediately spread through the room. It was not the loud celebration often seen at public events. It was something more sincere. People were not applauding because they had been instructed to do so. They were applauding because they had just learned an important lesson about respect, humility, and first impressions. Emily hesitated briefly before standing. As she walked toward the front of the ballroom, guests watched her with entirely different eyes than they had earlier that evening. The younger veterans who had once viewed her as an outsider now looked genuinely embarrassed. One of them lowered his head. Another quietly shook his own hand as though disappointed in himself. They had spent hours creating a story about Emily without knowing a single fact about her life. Now they understood how wrong those assumptions had been. When Emily reached the stage area, Ryan greeted her warmly. The audience applauded again. This time the applause lasted longer. Emily thanked everyone with a small nod before accepting a microphone. The room immediately became silent. Many people expected a dramatic speech. Others expected stories about military achievements or experiences that would further elevate her reputation. Instead, Emily smiled softly and delivered a response that surprised everyone. She thanked the organizers for inviting her and thanked Ryan for his kind words. Then she said something that instantly changed the tone of the evening. She explained that there was nothing unique about wanting to help the people around you. According to Emily, countless service members had spent their careers doing exactly that without seeking recognition. She insisted that the real story was not about one individual. It was about teamwork, trust, and the willingness of ordinary people to support one another. The audience listened carefully. There was no trace of self-promotion in her voice. She did not correct Ryan's praise, but she consistently redirected attention toward others. She spoke about mentors who had guided her, teammates who had inspired her, and friends whose example had shaped her own decisions throughout life. Every answer reflected humility. Every sentence revealed why people who knew her respected her so deeply. As Emily continued speaking, the younger veterans found themselves paying closer attention than anyone else in the room. They had expected confidence. They had expected pride. Instead, they witnessed genuine humility. The contrast forced them to confront their own behavior. The woman they had underestimated possessed a level of character they had not recognized. By the time Emily finished speaking, something important had changed inside the ballroom. The evening was no longer about a mysterious guest or a surprising salute. It had become a reminder that appearances reveal very little about a person's value. The audience rose into another round of applause, and this time it was clear that the respect being shown had nothing to do with reputation alone. It was being earned all over again through the quiet strength and humility that Emily had displayed from the moment she walked through the door. The applause continued long after Emily lowered the microphone. Many people remained standing, not because anyone had asked them to, but because they felt compelled to acknowledge what they had witnessed. Throughout the evening, the audience had learned far more than the identity of a remarkable guest. They had been reminded of something easy to forget in a world filled with quick judgments and surface impressions. Character often reveals itself quietly. As the applause gradually faded, the master of ceremonies thanked Emily once again and prepared to conclude the event. Before he could continue, Ryan Mitchell stepped forward one final time. The room immediately grew silent. Everyone sensed that he had one more thing to say. Ryan looked across the audience and then toward Emily. He explained that during his years of service, he had met many talented people. Some possessed exceptional skills. Others demonstrated extraordinary leadership. But only a small number left a lasting impact on everyone fortunate enough to work beside them. According to Ryan, Emily belonged in that rare group. He emphasized that her greatest contribution was not a single achievement or moment. It was the example she set through consistency, humility, and integrity. He explained that people often search for heroes in dramatic places while overlooking the individuals who quietly improve the lives of everyone around them. Ryan then shared a thought that seemed to resonate throughout the ballroom. He said that respect cannot be demanded, purchased, or manufactured. It is earned over time through actions that align with values. In his view, Emily had earned that respect many times over. The audience responded with another round of applause, stronger than before. This time, however, the applause carried a different feeling. It was no longer driven by surprise. It was driven by understanding. As the event officially came to an end, guests slowly began leaving their tables. Yet many chose not to head directly for the exits. Instead, they approached Emily. Some thanked her for her example. Others simply introduced themselves and expressed appreciation for her words. The younger veterans who had spent the first part of the evening making assumptions eventually gathered the courage to approach as well. Their expressions revealed genuine embarrassment. One of them apologized for judging her without knowing anything about her. Emily smiled kindly and accepted the apology without hesitation. She told them that everyone makes assumptions from time to time. What mattered was being willing to learn from them. The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but the lesson would stay with them far longer. Eventually, the ballroom began to empty. Decorations were quietly packed away. Chairs were folded. Staff members completed their final tasks for the evening. Emily prepared to leave just as she had arrived, without seeking attention. Before she reached the exit, Ryan caught up with her. The two exchanged a brief conversation and a warm handshake. Then they parted ways. There were no cameras surrounding them. No grand announcements. No attempt to prolong the spotlight. It was a simple ending, perfectly fitting for someone who had never wanted recognition in the first place. Yet long after the guests returned home, one memory remained clear in their minds. They remembered a quiet woman sitting alone in the back row. They remembered how easily she had been overlooked. And they remembered the moment an entire room learned that true greatness does not announce itself when it enters. Sometimes it simply takes a seat, waits patiently, and lets character speak for itself.